Most people don't struggle because they lack intelligence or effort. They struggle because no one ever explained the rules that quietly govern human behavior. If you've ever felt overlooked despite doing things right, misunderstood while trying to be reasonable, or drained from playing fair in situations that weren't designed to be fair, this channel is for you. Unspoken Laws doesn't teach manipulation. It reveals the dynamics already shaping outcomes whether you see them or not. Here, we replace confusion with clarity, not to make you harder, but to help you move through the world without losing yourself. Let's begin. What's rarely said is that status is not assigned the way most people think it is. It isn't handed out in meetings, it isn't voted on, and it isn't awarded for being correct, kind, or even indispensable. Status is quietly inferred, not from what you say about yourself, but from how the environment learns to read you over time. Most people assume status follows contribution, that if they add value, show reliability, and remain reasonable, recognition will naturally follow. Sometimes it does, but often, something else is happening beneath the surface. Status forms through pattern recognition. Others observe how you move when there is no spotlight, how you respond to pressure without explanation, how much of yourself you give before being asked, how quickly you accommodate, how much space you take up without defending it. None of this is announced. No one explains it while it's happening, and that's why it feels confusing when effort doesn't translate into standing. This isn't about being seen as important. It's about being read as anchored. People unconsciously track consistency. They notice who contains themselves when situations become unclear. They notice who rushes to restore harmony at their own expense. They notice who remains steady without insisting on agreement. Over time, these observations harden into assumptions, not judgments in words, but expectations in behavior. Who gets deferred to? Who gets interrupted? Who is consulted late? Who is quietly assumed to be flexible? Most people never realize this process is unfolding. They only feel the outcome. A subtle shift in how others address them. A quiet lowering of weight in the room. A sense of being present, yet slightly peripheral. This isn't a failure of character. It's a gap in awareness. When no one names the rules, people blame themselves. They try to become more helpful, more agreeable, more precise. And without intending to, they reinforce the very signals that keep status just out of reach. This channel exists to name what has been left unnamed, not to change who you are, but to help you see what is already being interpreted quietly, without announcement. Because once you can see the pattern, confusion begins to loosen, and clarity, slowly, takes its place. What most people don't realize is that status is rarely about what you claim. It's about what you permit to become predictable. Long before anyone forms an opinion, they form an expectation. And expectations are built from repetition, not intention. If you consistently explain yourself, the room learns that your position is flexible. If you consistently smooth over tension, the room learns that you will absorb discomfort. If you consistently adjust to keep things moving, the room learns that movement matters more to you than position. None of this is malicious. It's not a scheme. It's simply how social systems conserve energy. People lean on what bends. This is where many thoughtful, fair-minded people get quietly misread. They assume that restraint signals maturity, that patience signals depth, that not needing recognition signals confidence. And internally, those things may be true. But externally, the signal can land very differently. Because status isn't granted by intention, it's assigned through contrast. In any environment, there are unspoken reference points. Who pauses before responding? Who allows silence to remain unresolved? Who doesn't rush to clarify when misunderstood? Who doesn't chase alignment when it momentarily breaks? These moments seem small, often invisible, even to the person experiencing them. But they accumulate. Over time, others begin to orient themselves around these signals. Not consciously. They simply adjust their behavior without knowing why. They check in with certain people first. They phrase things more carefully. They wait for cues. And this is where confusion often sets in. Because from the inside, you may feel steady. You may feel principled. You may feel like you're doing the right thing. But from the outside, you may be registering as endlessly available, infinitely reasonable, always reachable. And availability, when unchecked, is rarely interpreted as strength. It's interpreted as elasticity. This isn't about withholding warmth, and it isn't about becoming distant or cold. It's about recognizing that containment communicates something effort never can. When someone doesn't over-explain, others fill in the gaps. When someone doesn't rush to repair, others slow down. When someone doesn't chase clarity, others grow more precise. Not because they were forced to, but because the environment adapts to what feels anchored. Status forms where there is weight, and weight is felt when something doesn't immediately yield. Many people sense this intuitively. They feel that something is off, but can't name it. They feel respected in theory, but not in practice. This isn't because they lack value. It's because the signals they've been sending were never explained to them. And once you start seeing those signals clearly, the entire dynamic begins to make more sense. There is a quiet moment where this becomes especially visible. It usually happens when expectations collide. Someone asks for more than you have offered. A boundary is brushed against, not aggressively, just lightly, and without realizing it, you respond faster than the moment requires. You clarify, you reassure, you adjust. From the inside, this feels like responsibility, like being reasonable, like preventing unnecessary friction. But from the outside, something else is being learned. Not about your intentions, about your center. Social environments are always scanning for stability, not moral stability, structural stability. Who remains intact when things are slightly misaligned? Who tolerates a bit of tension without dissolving it? Who doesn't need to be immediately understood in order to stay present? This is where status quietly settles. Because when a system senses that someone will always close the gap, the system stops respecting the gap. It begins to lean. Again, not maliciously, just efficiently. Most people were never taught this distinction. They were taught to be clear, to be kind, to be cooperative. And those traits matter, but without containment, they are misinterpreted. Containment doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean withdrawal. It means proportion. It means allowing your response to match the weight of the moment, not the discomfort of the pause. People who carry quiet authority are often misunderstood at first. They don't rush to align. They don't hurry to smooth things over. They don't correct every misreading immediately. Not because they are aloof, but because they trust that clarity doesn't always need speed. Over time, others begin to adjust around this. They slow down. They become more careful with assumptions. They bring more coherence to their own words. And this is important, because status is not something you demand. It's something others accommodate. When someone consistently over-accommodates, the environment stops accommodating them. This is where many people feel a quiet resentment building, not toward others, toward themselves. They sense that something is wrong, but they can't locate the source. They tell themselves they need to try harder, be clearer, be more generous, be more understanding. But the issue was never effort. It was signal. Signals don't respond to intention. They respond to pattern. And until those patterns are seen for what they are, the same outcomes quietly repeat. This isn't about becoming someone else. It's about noticing where your presence has been leaking and understanding how the world has been reading that absence. Once that awareness settles in, the confusion begins to soften. There's another layer to this that almost no one talks about. Status isn't only shaped by how you respond when things go wrong. It's shaped by how you behave when nothing is demanded of you at all. Most people assume visibility creates standing. That speaking up, contributing often, staying engaged, signals importance. And in some environments, that's true in the short term. But over time, something subtler takes over. People notice who doesn't need to fill space, who doesn't rush to add value just to remain relevant, who can remain present without constantly proving usefulness. This is uncomfortable for many thoughtful people because they were raised to believe that contribution equals worth, that silence risks being forgotten, that stepping back means falling behind. So they stay active, they stay responsive, they stay available. And slowly, without anyone intending it, their presence becomes background infrastructure rather than focal weight. When something becomes reliable to the point of invisibility, it stops being treated as a reference point. It becomes a resource. This is one of the quietest shifts in social life, and one of the most painful to experience without understanding. You may notice that people assume your time is flexible, that your agreement is likely, that your role is to stabilize rather than to set direction. None of this is said out loud. It's felt in tone, in timing, in who waits and who doesn't. What's important here is not blame, neither toward others nor toward yourself. Social systems are adaptive. They respond to signals, not to fairness. And when someone consistently signals readiness, the system stops checking whether readiness should be assumed. Status, in this sense, is less about being admired and more about being anticipated. People with quiet authority are anticipated differently, not because they are louder or more forceful, but because their presence is not automatic. They are felt as deliberate, measured, contained. This doesn't mean they contribute less. It means their contribution has edges, and edges create orientation. When everything flows freely, nothing becomes a point of reference. Many people sense this mismatch without language for it. They feel busy but not influential, included but not centered, respected in theory but not deferred to in practice. This isn't a personal flaw. It's the result of a system responding to consistency without containment. Once you see that, something shifts internally. Not urgency, not defensiveness, just a quieter understanding of why things have been unfolding the way they have. And with that understanding, a different relationship to presence begins to emerge. There's a point where this realization becomes uncomfortable, not because it's harsh, but because it's precise. You begin to notice how often your presence has been shaped around preventing friction rather than holding position. How often your instincts move towards smoothing, clarifying, or absorbing before the moment has even fully formed. Again, this isn't weakness. It's intelligence tuned toward harmony. But harmony, when prioritized without boundaries, teaches the environment something specific. It teaches others that tension will always be resolved for them. And when tension is always resolved externally, it is no longer respected internally. This is one of the least visible dynamics of status. People don't defer to those who eliminate uncertainty too quickly. They defer to those around whom uncertainty is allowed to exist. Because uncertainty creates a tension. When someone doesn't rush to close the loop, others stay mentally engaged. They listen more closely. They choose words more carefully. They pause before assuming. That pause is not intimidation, it's orientation. Many people believe authority comes from certainty, from being decisive, from having answers ready. But quiet authority often comes from the opposite. From not needing to resolve everything immediately, from allowing things to remain unfinished without anxiety. This is where self-respect becomes visible without being declared. Self-respect isn't asserted, it's inferred from pacing. How quickly you respond, how much you explain, how easily you rearrange yourself to fit the moment. None of these are moral choices, they're signals. And signals, once repeated, become your default reading. People don't consciously think, this person matters less. They simply feel less need to adjust around you. That's the part most people miss. Status is not about being elevated. It's about others adjusting. When adjustment only flows in one direction, the imbalance becomes structural. Many thoughtful people live inside that imbalance for years. They tell themselves it's fine, that being adaptable is a strength, that being easy to work with is enough, until they notice the quiet cost, not in dramatic conflict, but in subtle erosion. Fewer pauses when they speak, decisions forming without them, assumptions made about their availability, nothing overt, nothing worth confronting, just enough to feel vaguely diminished. Understanding this isn't meant to harden you, it's meant to bring relief. Because once you see that status has been quietly assigned through signal rather than worth, the self-blame begins to loosen. And in that space, a different kind of steadiness becomes possible. At this stage, something subtle usually happens internally. Not a decision, not a plan, just a quiet noticing. You start to observe how often your body moves before your mind does. How quickly you lean forward into responsibility. How naturally you take on the role of stabilizer when something feels off. This isn't because you want status. It's because you're attuned. You sense imbalance early. You feel discomfort before others name it. And you've learned, over time, to respond to that signal by correcting the environment. But here's what's rarely acknowledged. When one person consistently absorbs the instability of a system, the system begins to rely on that absorption. Not consciously, not deliberately. It simply relaxes. And relaxation, in social systems, doesn't flow toward those doing the work. It flows away from them. This is why people who hold things together are often the least protected by the structure they support. Their steadiness becomes assumed. Their effort disappears into the background. Status, in this sense, follows containment, not contribution. Containment doesn't mean withholding care. It means not rushing to neutralize every disturbance. When someone allows a moment of discomfort to remain, others become more aware of their own role in it. They adjust. They self-regulate. But when someone consistently intervenes early, that awareness never develops. Over time, the environment becomes less careful around them. This is where many people feel a quiet exhaustion that doesn't have a clear cause. They aren't overworked in obvious ways. They're simply over-absorbing. They hold emotional weight. They hold relational balance. They hold continuity. And because they hold it well, it's rarely acknowledged. The shift that begins here is not behavioral. It's perceptual. You start to see that being dependable is not the same as being centered. That being understanding is not the same as being oriented around. And that realization can feel destabilizing at first, not because it's threatening, but because it reframes so much of what you thought was working. This isn't about pulling away. It's about noticing where your presence has been compensating for the system's lack of structure. Once that becomes visible, something inside you naturally slows, not as a tactic, as a recalibration. You begin to feel the difference between responding from alignment and responding from habit. And that distinction quietly changes how others experience you. As this recalibration settles, another pattern becomes easier to see. Status is not assigned in moments of intensity. It's assigned in moments of neutrality. Most people think influence is determined during conflict, negotiation, or high-stakes decisions. But by the time those moments arrive, the hierarchy is already set. What matters more is what happens in the ordinary spaces, the unremarkable pauses, the small exchanges that don't seem consequential at the time. Who speaks without scanning for approval? Who allows silence to land without rushing to soften it? Who doesn't subtly reposition themselves when the atmosphere shifts? These moments pass quickly. They rarely register consciously, but they are remembered somatically. People feel them before they think them. Someone who remains settled when nothing is demanded of them begins to register as stable, not impressive, not dominant, stable. And stability is one of the quietest markers of status. Because when someone appears internally organized, others unconsciously organize around them. They reference them without realizing they are doing so. They check their reactions. They wait. This is why people who carry quiet authority often seem unremarkable at first glance. They aren't performing presence. They aren't signaling urgency. They are simply not pulled out of themselves by the environment. For those who have spent years adapting quickly, this can feel counterintuitive, almost irresponsible. There can be an internal voice that says, if I don't respond, something will fall apart. If I don't clarify, I'll be misunderstood. If I don't smooth this over, I'll lose ground. But what's rarely examined is what has actually been lost by always stepping in. When someone always arrives early to stabilize the moment, they're never experienced as someone others must orient toward. They are experienced as someone who will orient themselves. That difference is subtle, but it's decisive. Status doesn't grow where movement is automatic. It grows where movement feels considered. And considered movement doesn't need explanation. It's felt. As this becomes clearer, many people notice a shift in their own pacing. They don't force it. They don't announce it. They simply allow moments to pass without filling them. And in those unfilled moments, others begin to show more of themselves, their assumptions, their expectations, their level of care. This isn't about testing people. It's about allowing the structure to reveal itself. And once you can see that structure clearly, the rules stop feeling personal. They start to feel legible. When the structure becomes legible, another quiet truth surfaces. Status is not something people give you. It's something they stop taking from you. This is where the shift deepens. Most people think loss of standing comes from being challenged, overlooked, or replaced. But more often, it comes from something softer, from what is slowly extracted without resistance. Your time, your emotional labor, your readiness to explain, your willingness to stay available even when the exchange is uneven. None of this feels like loss in the moment. It feels like being decent, being cooperative, being mature. And yet, over time, something thins. Not your competence, not your integrity, your density. People begin to approach you differently, not with disrespect, but with assumption. Assumption that you will adjust. Assumption that you will understand. Assumption that you will carry what hasn't been properly held elsewhere. Again, no one decides this consciously. It emerges from repetition. This is why status rarely changes through confrontation, because confrontation addresses behavior, not assumption. Assumptions only shift when patterns change, and patterns don't change through effort. They change through containment. Containment is not refusal. It's presence with limits. It's allowing others to feel the weight of their own expectations. It's not rushing to translate your meaning into something more digestible. It's letting the moment sit long enough for others to notice themselves. This is uncomfortable at first, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. Many people mistake this discomfort for selfishness, or withdrawal, or coldness. But what's actually happening is a rebalancing of attention. When you stop compensating, the environment has to adjust, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes slowly. And in that adjustment, something important is revealed. Who steps up? Who recalibrates? Who becomes more careful? Status quietly accumulates here, not because you demanded it, but because you are no longer diffusing your own presence. People begin to feel you as more solid, less predictable, more defined, not louder, not sharper, just less available for unconscious extraction. This doesn't make you less kind. It makes your kindness legible. And when kindness has edges, it stops being consumed without recognition. This is where many people feel a surprising sense of relief. Not empowerment, not triumph, relief. Because for the first time, their presence no longer feels endlessly open-ended. It feels contained, and containment, quietly, changes everything. By the time this understanding settles, the question of status begins to feel less charged. Not because it no longer matters, but because it no longer feels mysterious. You start to see that what you once interpreted as rejection was often orientation. What felt like being overlooked was frequently the system responding exactly as it had been trained to respond. This realization can be strangely calming, not because it excuses the imbalance, but because it removes the sense that something was inherently wrong with you. You were not invisible, you were readable, and what was being read was consistency without containment. At this stage, many people notice a subtle internal shift. They feel less compelled to manage impressions, less invested in being immediately understood, less reactive to small misalignments. Not out of indifference, out of grounding. When you stop interpreting every interaction as feedback about your worth, you gain the space to remain present without self-correction. And presence without self-correction is felt. Others may not name it, but they experience you as steadier, less porous, more defined. This is where quiet authority begins to register. Not as a role, as a quality. People speak differently around you. They pause more. They check their assumptions instead of projecting them outward. Again, not because you demanded anything, but because you are no longer organizing yourself around the room. The room begins to organize itself around you. This is not dominance. It's orientation. And orientation feels safe. It's important to say this clearly. Nothing here requires you to become colder, harder, or less human. In fact, the opposite is often true. When you are no longer leaking attention, you have more of yourself available to be genuine. Your care becomes intentional rather than reflexive. Your generosity becomes chosen rather than assumed. And that choice is felt. Status, at this point, is no longer something you chase or resist. It becomes a byproduct of coherence. You move at your own pace. You respond when there is something real to respond to. You allow silence to do some of the work. And in doing so, you stop teaching the environment that you will always arrive early to hold it together. This doesn't make life frictionless, but it makes it clearer. And clarity, quietly, restores balance long before anyone names it. By now, it should be clearer that nothing here was ever about fixing yourself. There was no missing confidence, no hidden flaw in your character, no failure to assert something you were supposed to know. What was missing was language. Language for a process that happens quietly, without explanation. Language for how status forms long before anyone speaks about it. Language for why thoughtful, fair, capable people so often feel slightly out of position without knowing why. You were never broken. You were simply operating inside rules that were never made explicit. Status was not denied to you. It was assigned through signals you were never taught to recognize. Once you see that, the emotional charge begins to fade. Not because the world suddenly becomes fair, but because it becomes legible. And legibility brings calm. You no longer need to correct every misunderstanding. You no longer feel compelled to stabilize every moment. You no longer rush to make yourself easy to place. Not as an act of resistance, as a return to center. This is what clarity offers. Not power over others, but relief from unnecessary self-adjustment. Quiet authority is not something you perform. It emerges when you stop abandoning your own pacing, when you allow your presence to have edges, when you trust that being intact is more stabilizing than being endlessly accommodating. From here, nothing dramatic needs to happen. No announcement, no reinvention. The change is subtle. You take a breath before responding. You let silence finish its work. You stay with yourself even when the room shifts. And gradually, others feel that steadiness. They don't analyze it. They don't label it. They simply orient differently. This is not about status as a prize. It's about self-respect becoming visible. And when self-respect is visible, the world responds in quieter, more grounded ways. Not always immediately, not always perfectly, but enough to restore balance. Enough to move through life without constantly questioning your place in it. That is the point of this channel. Not to harden you, but to give you clarity where confusion once lived, so you can remain thoughtful without being drained, present without being overextended, and grounded, even when no one explains the rules. And from that place, status is no longer something you chase. It settles, quietly,